This is Craig Brown, and welcome to Passages. Passages is a space to explore Bible passages used for preaching, reflection, and prayer. My hope is that Passages will shine a unique light on text used for preaching at the First Free Methodist Church of Seattle, or for anyone looking to dive deeper into the Bible. Today's passage is Luke chapter 19, verses 28 to 40. It's the basis of the sermon at First Free Methodist Church on Sunday, April 13, 2025, which happens to be Palm or Passion Sunday. It's part of our series called Believe, Discovering Faith and Hope in Jesus. So let's hear the passage beginning in Luke 19 at verse 28. After Jesus said these things, he was going on ahead, going up to Jerusalem. When he approached Bethphage and Bethany, near the mount that is called Olivet, he sent two of the disciples, saying, "Go into the village ahead of you. There, as you enter, you will find a colt tied on which no one has yet ever sat. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, 'Why are you untying it?' you shall say this, 'The Lord has need of it.'" So those who were sent left and found it just as he had told them. And as they were untying the colt, its owner said to them, "Why are you untying the colt?" They said, "The Lord has need of it." And they brought it to Jesus, and they threw their cloaks on the colt and put Jesus on it. Now as he was going, they were spreading their cloaks on the road, and as soon as he was approaching near the descent of the Mount of Olives, the whole crowd of the disciples began to praise God joyfully with a loud voice for all the miracles which they had seen, shouting, "Blessed is the King, the one who comes in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven and glory in the highest." And yet some of the Pharisees and the crowd said to him, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples." And Jesus replied, "I tell you, if these stop speaking, the stones will cry out." So as we look at this well-known text of Jesus' entrance to the city of Jerusalem on what we call Palm Sunday, let's look first at the way in which Jesus chooses to transport himself, and that would be the way of peace. Now, Jesus makes his arrival to Jerusalem from the east, and it's a long climb up the mountains from the Jordan River Valley in Jericho where he has been. But now as he approaches, he nears Jerusalem, and he comes near two towns. One is called Bethphage, and the other is called Bethany. Bethphage means house of unripe figs, and Bethany means house of dates. In Hebrew, bet is the word for house. So it's bet, and then whatever follows that describes what that house is. So for example, in Bethlehem, that word means house of bread. Bet meaning house, and lechem meaning the word for bread. Now, Bethphage and Bethany are places on the eastern slope of the Mount of Olives, and this is the mount that overlooks the city of Jerusalem from the east. So two disciples are sent by Jesus to secure the transportation needed, and they were given clear instructions. Now, people see this as perhaps Jesus being clairvoyant, that there's somebody out there that has a donkey or a colt, and the disciples are supposed to ask, and in some mysterious way, the owner says, "That's fine, just take my property." But the owner of the animal may have known Jesus. We don't know exactly how this happened. We do know is Jesus has spent a good deal of time in Bethany. Lazarus is his friend. Bethany is Lazarus' hometown. It's also where many of the stories we read about Mary and Martha occur, who are Lazarus' sisters. Now, the animal itself has differing versions depending on which gospel you read. Sometimes it's a young donkey, sometimes it's a young horse. The cultural meaning is the same, though. It is a young, unridden animal. And oftentimes when these types of animals were used, their first use was often for a sacred purpose. Then it would be used for whatever other utility was necessary. And this young animal, a colt of a donkey or of a horse, it's contrasted in its strength to a full-grown horse. Very different things. This is an animal that is not swift, it's not nimble, it's never had a rider on it, very inexperienced. Now, this is all part of setting the stage for Passover, which is about to begin in the city of Jerusalem. Passover is a Jewish holiday, and it's a commemoration of Israel's liberation from slavery in Egypt under the leadership of Moses. So it's really about Jewish independence. In this way, it's kind of the American equivalent of it's the Israeli equivalent of the 4th of July here in America. So during this time, when kind of patriotism runs at a high, Romans would come into the city to ensure that there was no uprising as there had been before. We know from other historians and even Jesus's own teaching, where he speaks about how Pilate slaughtered a bunch of Galileans near the temple, that there's been occasion when there's been uprisings in the city that the Roman soldiers had to put down. Now, these Roman soldiers, of course, didn't enter the city on a donkey or the colt of a foal. Rather, they came in stallions and horses, full-grown animals of war and battle. So Jesus' choice of animal is somewhat peculiar, but yet clear. And this is the only time we read in the Gospels where Jesus isn't walking. It's the only time in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John where Jesus is riding on something. And it's a strong contrast to the notion of empire in the story. The Romans represent empire coming into the city from the west, from where Pilate's palace was in Caesarea Maritima. Jesus is entering the city from the east. The Romans enter with soldiers and power and stallions and horses, and Jesus enters into the city on a colt or a donkey. Now, another piece that you should know from the ancient world is that oftentimes when two armies would be in a battle together, and the generals or the leaders of those armies wanted to have a parley, or they wanted to have a meeting together to discuss terms, they would often ride into the field of battle, not waving a white flag as we normally think, but they would come riding a donkey or an animal that wasn't swift of foot. And so it communicated to the other general or the other commander that one was coming to negotiate, or one was coming in peace, not to battle. And so all this about the transport, or the mode of transport Jesus uses, is so important. It opens a key passageway to us, that the advent of the gospel comes in peace and brings peace. The advent of the gospel comes in peace and brings peace. Jesus communicates quite clearly that his coming is not in the trappings of power and empire. His arrival in this manner is kind of an affront to those who would like to see him as a political or even a military figure. Jesus is not just making a statement about political power, but he's also making an affirmation that his is a coming into the city of Jerusalem, and even coming into this world, that will bring peace. And as such, it's an enduring reign that goes way past and way above any empire of this age. As Jesus approaches the city, the disciples become more and more a part of this story. It's really about the acclaim offered to Jesus and this proclamation of peace that we begin to read about in this story in Luke's gospel. Now, when the colt arrives in Jesus' presence, it says that the disciples brought the colt, the disciples put their cloaks on the colt, and the disciples put Jesus on the colt. Now, Luke's version of the story is really subdued. So if you read this same story in Matthew or Mark's gospel, the way Luke writes it is completely different. There's no big crowd there. There's nothing about any of this, giant spectacle. It's almost like the only people that are there are the disciples. Now, the disciples, it says, spread their cloaks in front of the colt, and that is an act of submission. They're surrendering their own possessions to the authority of the one riding on the colt. So the colt likely had no saddle or other accessories, so putting their cloaks on the colt and putting their cloaks in the road is a significant statement about how the disciples regarded Jesus. Now, Jesus arrives on the colt at the peak of the Mount of Olives, then he begins his descent down the Mount of Olives into a valley before he can go up a smaller hill into the city of Jerusalem. That valley that Jesus travels through is called the Kidron Valley. And the text tells us that the whole crowd of the disciples. Now, this isn't to say that it was just the 12, but it was likely all those who followed him. And so again, notice that there's no big public crowd or sensational crowd. Luke omits all of that from the story. There's little sense that this is the same crowd here that's going to turn on Jesus by Friday. Like in Matthew and Mark, it seems like the crowd that welcomes Jesus to Jerusalem here is the same crowd that turns on him on Good Friday. Luke doesn't give you any of that. Luke just simply says that the followers or the crowd of his disciples were a part of this event. And the story has in Luke's gospel, a very non-Jewish feeling to it, or ethos. There are no palm branches or tree branches in this story. So it's ironic that we call Luke's version of the story Palm Sunday, because there are no palms involved anywhere. Luke has little interest in connecting messianic expectations. And because Luke's gospel is dominantly written to a Greek-speaking world, so people aren't going to have a lot of kind of inside knowledge about how the Jewish community or Jewish nationalism works. And so what Luke is offering up here is a story of Jesus entering Jerusalem that's very much in contrast to how empire or the Romans are entering the city. And so the disciples have an affirmation that they say as Jesus enters the city. They say first, "Blessed is the King." Note that affirmation is king, so it's an insult not only to Herod, but it is an insult to Caesar as well. They say, "Blessed is the King, the one who comes in the name of the Lord." This was a traditional greeting for pilgrims, and it was a traditional greeting given for the entrance of kings into a city or an area. Then they say, "Peace in heaven and glory in the highest." There's that theme of peace again, but I want you to look at the words carefully: peace in heaven and glory in the highest. If you flip all the way back in Luke's gospel to the beginning of the story of Jesus' birth, when the angels appeared to the shepherds, this is the same exact language they used: peace in heaven and glory in the highest. This is a cosmic event of peace. Notice, too, that Luke doesn't include any hosannas in this story. And Hosanna literally means, for the Jewish community, God save us. And remember, Luke's not writing to a Jewish community, so a Hosanna would just be confusing to the people that his gospel is written to. Luke, again, doesn't include any palms or leafy branches. Those are symbols of Jewish nationalism. Luke's Gentile readers would have no understanding of what these symbols mean. So Luke is carefully putting a story together, in other words, telling us how this event happened in a way that his Greek and Roman listeners would have understood it. And that opens a key passageway to us, that the confrontation of empire or power is first and foremost affirmative. The confrontation of empire or power is first and foremost affirmative. And here's what I mean by that. We live in a time of Christian activism on both sides of the polarity, whether it's conservative or progressive. And what this story is telling us is that power is not necessarily achieved by inhabiting systems of political governance. There's nothing wrong with serving in political systems, but to use political systems as an agency for religious reform, that is a different story. So what Jesus does here is something that is in the affirmative. There's no critique here of the Romans. There's no critique of the Jewish authorities. There's no critique of Caesar or Herod or anybody. There's just an affirmation about Jesus. There's no need to reject Herod or Caesar. There's just the need to lift up the name of Jesus, to affirm him, to celebrate him. The tendency that often we have is to wag the finger in criticism of secular culture or something like that. This is the law of diminishing returns. What the story is telling us in some ways is that the best way for us to challenge those systems and confront them is to embody the peace and presence of Jesus first. now turn to this resistance that's going to assert itself in this story. And this has to do with the power of peace when it comes into being. Now, Luke is the only version of this story to include these short closing verses about the Pharisees. Now, they acknowledge Jesus as a teacher because that's what they call him, which implies that they may be sympathetic to Jesus. They tell Jesus to get his disciples to calm down. He said they tell Jesus to rebuke your disciples. So we learn something important here about the disciples. Even though Luke doesn't tell us about a big crowd and a giant gathering, the disciples that were there were making a scene of it. And so the motivation of the Pharisees is a question we might ask. Are they disagreeing with the disciples' affirmation of Jesus as the king and the one who comes in the name of the Lord? Or are they concerned that this is going to draw too much attention? Are they worried about feeling aligned with this king who comes in peace? Are the Pharisees maybe feeling threatened? Jesus simply affirms that what the disciples are doing is true and right. And he tells the Pharisees that even if they didn't, the stones would cry out. Jesus, in some sense, tells them that the stones have more recognition of who he is and courage about who he is than they do. And this opens up a key passageway for us, an important one. The gospel of peace is a subversion, yet it's a public one. The gospel of peace is a subversion, yet it is a public one. The way of Jesus here is public. It's noticed. It's unhidden. It's a message of subversion to both religious empire and to the Roman Empire. Its power in the face of this resistance it's encountering is undeniable. It means for us that our witness of and with Christ is public. We own it publicly, whether we're at work, at school, at home. Remember, it's not an assertion of power and control. It's not about becoming sanctimonious. It's an affirmation that Jesus is Lord, the only Lord. And on this Palm Sunday, which is ironic for Luke's version of the story because there are no palms, it's a day to locate ourselves in the story. So we could speak again of the donkey. Are we a vessel of peace that bring Jesus' presence into the world? Are we like the disciples? Are we those who celebrate and affirm Jesus and submit ourselves to him? Or are we perhaps detractors? Are we those who resist Jesus to save face and to curry favor with people? All good questions. And the coming of Jesus on this day invites us to consider all of them. If you have comments or reflections, I'd love to hear from you. Please visit my website, revcraig.com. Click on News in the upper right-hand corner, and on the drop-down menu, select Podcast, and then click on this week's episode and leave a comment. I'd also encourage you to visit our church's website, ffmc.org, firstfreemethodistchurch.org, to learn more about Free Methodism and how you can connect with our community. For now, I bid you all grace. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.